Sometimes in the history of weapons there's huge technological advancement. However, I want to demonstrate to you that from the 15th century and certainly from the early 16th century, there really wasn't actually an awful lot of development in the science of swords, certainly as far as hand protection goes. Hi folks, Matt Easton here, Scholar Gladiatoria. Now, I think many channels on YouTube and perhaps even some books, and I would say my channel included, are sometimes a little bit guilty of giving the wrong impression that was the huge advancement in technological advancement in the technology and particularly the hand protection and hilts of swords between the Middle Ages and let's say the industrial 19th century. So I've got here a Danish cavalry saber, and I've got here a replica of one of the Alexandria swords, which does feature a finger ring, but fundamentally has a simple cross hilt. And hand protection is something which is easy to point out as something which changes in swords, because of course, as we start to look at the development of swords across the centuries, one of the things which most visually changes immediately certainly as we get into the 16th century, is the complexity of and protectiveness of hilts. So absolutely admittedly, things like this side sword and the rapier up here, and indeed as we get into things like basket hilts, do have more hand protection. But I want to point out two things to you. I want to point out that between the 15th century and the 19th century, these swords are kind of the outliers. They are the swords with the greatest amount of hand protection, firstly, and secondly, pretty much as soon as we get to the end of the 15th century and into the 16th century, we have already got a variety of swords with some degree of hand protection, which is pretty much equivalent to 19th century sabres. So actually, if we look at a lot of military swords from around the year 1500, they really don't have any less hand protection or complexity to swords of around the year 1850. Right, let's look at some examples here. So pretty much straight away as we get into the arming swords start to develop into the sort of side swords, or what we refer to as side swords now. One of the first things we start to get are forms of finger rings and side rings. Now, finger rings primarily are really there, and this is a very early form of, to protect only the finger, only because you're putting it over the crossguard. You put it over the crossguard, fingering the guard. You can look up loads of videos I've done about this on this channel. Fingering the guard is really about control and the way that you're using the weapon, but as soon as you put that finger over the guard, it becomes necessary to protect it with another guard, so you stick a finger ring on there. And then at some point, some of those swords are reversible, so you stick two finger rings on, and then at some point they go, we can protect the fingers even better by adding them with a ring here, and sometimes an additional ring here. So pretty much immediately we start to get side projections of guards. I refer you to the 19th century sabre. So at that point we have side projection, predominantly on the right hand side with military sabres, as well as an extension which protects the top of the hand here. So that's pretty much equivalent. Now you might be pointing out, you might be thinking rather, that with the military sabres, one of the characteristic things of them that we have in the 19th century is they pretty much all have a frontal section here known as a knuckle bow. Well, surprise, surprise, the knuckle bow had actually been around in its earliest forms. Well, if we could go all the way back to the falcata, in fact, we can actually find it in the classical world. So it had existed for a long, long time. But in European sword development, they already started to become somewhat present, probably at the end of the 14th century, but certainly by the middle of the 15th century. And this leads to these types of hangers and swords which have the knuckle bow on, and in fact some of those additionally have a sidebar added as well. Now this is a prototype of the hanger that we did with the Royal Armouries, where the original has the whatever projected from the side is broken off, so it's conjectural. We actually decided to not include that on the final version, and in fact we've just got a lug or nagel as you'd find on a Langmesser, because actually looking at the details of that extension, it is very thin and very small at the end, and I think it's unlikely that it had a full bar side extension. But some of them did, and there is another example in the Royal Armouries which has a hilt like this with a sidebar on it, and that dates to about the year 1500. It's probably a little bit later than the one that we actually replicated. So indeed, we do have knuckle bows on these hangers already in probably the early 1400s in fact, but certainly commonly by the middle of the 1400s, so middle of the 15th century. And by the end of the 15th century, we sometimes have sidebars on here as well. Now, let's just go back for a second to this sabre. If you look at the amount of hand protection being offered to the front and the side and the top from these things, it is really very, very comparable and quite equivalent. So actually a lot of 19th century sabres that even have quite protective guards like this are really no more protective than certain late 15th and early 16th century swords in existence hundreds of years earlier. And in fact, as some of you will know only too well, there are certain types of 19th century, early 19th century in this case, sword or sabre, that have even less protection than that. So in this case, the early 16th century hilt form here, or late 15th century hilt form, is actually more protective than the later period sabre hilt of this simple knuckle bow type. So while it's certainly true to point out that certain types of medieval sword have less hand protection than certain types of 19th century sword, it's in no way a linear progression, because as we've seen, there are certain types of 15th century sword which already have quite a lot of hand protection, and of course by the time we get to 1530 we've got full basket hilts. So already by 1530 we've got some of the most protective hilts that have ever been designed. And in fact by the year 1600 there were of course rapiers of various sorts, including early cup hilts as well, all sorts of basket hilts and side sword hilts that were hugely protective to the hands. But I want to give another example as well. So comparable to this sort of hilt, which is quite specifically English, as we've seen, the side sword hilt here, which often have a knuckle bow on them as well, so they have side rings and a knuckle bow, completely comparative to 19th century sabres. But there's another very common type of hilt found on earlier, should we call it dussac, tessac, early forms of cutlass and hanger and sabre. And in fact, it's swords like this that almost certainly led to the development of swords like this. I think a lot of people think of Western cavalry sabres, for example, as something which comes explicitly from contact with people like the Ottoman Turks or with North African forces or whatever, but actually already in medieval Europe, and I have to say this is a borrowed sword to my friend Darren, who you might know if you ever come down to our Woking Club, this type of early dussac, which has a knuckle bow, it has a side ring, it has a rear quillon. Now we pick up a sabre and compare that, the kind of area of protection of the hand is very, very comparable. And these types of sword were already around in the 1400s and were really, really common sidearm for soldiers and civilians in the 1500s. So, sometimes I think we get distracted by the particularly protective hilts of basket hilts or certain types of rapiers. Actually, a lot of military swords in the 1400s and 1500s already had as much hand protection as many 19th century military sabres. And it really didn't change. We can find swords like this with this degree of hand protection already in the 1400s, all the way through the 1500s, 1600s, 1700s, 1800s. And they really didn't change. So it's kind of optimal for a military person who doesn't want to have a fully enclosed basket hilt, swept hilt or cup hilt. Not to say that those things weren't around, because of course they were also. So we need to get out of this thinking of linear development. And of course it's worth saying that one of the reasons that arming swords had such simple hilts in the Middle Ages was that the people they were primarily designed for, men-at-arms and knights, often wore gauntlets or mailed gloves, or at least sturdy leather gloves. So really, as we get into the age where people aren't necessarily wearing that type of hand protection, then these types of bars and stuff become pretty much immediately important. And that's why already by the year 1530 we get the development of the full basket hilt, which really is quite mind-blowing when you consider that the majority of arming swords throughout the 1400s were just a simple crossbar cross hilt. But then already early in the 1500s, we've already got all of these added frontal bars and side bars and rings, and indeed the full basket hilt shown there, and the beginnings of the swept hilt that we slightly later on find on rapiers as well. Anyway, I hope this has been thought-provoking. The main message here is don't think about hilt development as necessarily a linear thing, but also remember it started much earlier than most people realise, and once they achieved a certain amount of frontal protection and top and side protection, that pretty much stayed all the way through for the whole rest of the military history of swords until the modern gunpowder age, basically. Anyway, thanks a lot for watching. I will see you back on the channel again soon. Cheers, folks. Thanks for watching. We've got extra videos on Patreon. Please give our Facebook a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Cheers, folks.